Hi all, this is the first part of section 2.4 of fiscal policy. Here we will cover the basics that need to know before we get into the application of fiscal policy. Here's the rough outline for the unit. In this video we will be covering the bold sections, definition, purpose and the budget. And then in class we'll work on how it works and of course evaluating the use of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is quite simply the spending and taxation plans of a government. I've used the image on the left because we've already seen extensively how money can influence behaviour, and that's really what governments are trying to do with their spending plans, change people's behaviour. The image on the right is a shakedown. The government shaking all the money loose from the public. This is how some people quite dramatically feel about the relationship between citizens and the government when it comes to tax collection. The purpose of fiscal policy is to affect the demand side of an economy, that is, to shift aggregate demand. One way in which this happens should be quite obvious, as G, government spending, is a component of AD. What I want you to do now is draw two ADAS diagrams, nice and big because you'll want to annotate them. One should show an inflationary gap and one should show a recessionary gap. Pause now and do this. Excellent. Here is our inflationary gap, characterized by too much demand in the economy. Resources are becoming more scarce, so prices are being bid up. This includes the price of labour as we move beyond full employment. What the government would want to do here is shift the AD curve back to the left, that way. And what that will do is they'll bring the economy back to the full employment equilibrium and they remove the inflationary problem, just like this. There you go. Notice how I'm projecting out to the axes there as well. And then here is our recessionary gap, characterized by a lack of demand in the economy. Firms in the economy will not produce at the potential real GDP because it's not worth it. There's not the demand, people won't buy the goods and services that they produce. Unemployment is going to be more than the natural rate. Of course, what the government would want to do here is shift AD over to the right so that the economy can reach its long-run equilibrium and they eliminate the growth and jobs problems. So, like this. Now, where does the money for fiscal policy come from? I'm sure you're all thinking one word, taxes, and yes, predominantly. But of course there are two types of tax, one which we've looked at extensively already in microeconomics. They are of course direct taxes and indirect taxes. Direct taxes are imposed directly on income and wealth and include personal income tax, company taxes, so taxes on profits, and wealth taxes, taxes on what you own. So a land tax might be a good example of that. Indirect taxes are predominantly the GST, but also there are significant contributions from tobacco, fuel and alcohol, and indirect taxes overall provide about 20% of Australian federal revenue. Another source of government revenue is from government-owned enterprises, essentially government businesses. Governments often own utilities such as gas, electricity and water, with the bill revenue counting as government revenue. In South Australia, much of this has been privatised, but in the eastern states and other countries, utilities are widely public-owned. The same applies to transport. Fair revenue will go to governments where there is public ownership. Telecommunications in the days before mobile phones was all government owned. Before Telstra we had Telecom Australia, and the bill money of course would count as government revenue. A postal service is one more enterprise that is commonly government run and therefore revenue producing. This accounts for most of the balance of the revenue received by governments. The final source of government revenue is a less stable one. The selling of government assets. It's less stable because you can only sell it once. Selling government-owned enterprises is known as privatisation, the transfer of ownership from public hands to private hands. Some examples are Telstra, which was formerly Telecom, AGL, which is formerly the Electricity Trust of South Australia, Commonwealth Bank, so named because it was the Bank of the Commonwealth of Australia, and SGIC, formerly known as State Government Insurance Commission. Okay, so that's how governments get their revenue. Now we need to classify spending. In general, we have either current or capital expenditures. Current expenditures are of a more ongoing basis. Salaries for government staff, like me, ongoing hardware and software requirements, and the emergency services need recurrent funding too. Anything that we can't just throw a bunch of money at and then say it's done. Street lighting is an example of this. The street lights are capital expenditures, but the electricity to make them is a current expenditure because we have to keep on buying that electricity. So I like to think of these as consumption spending. Capital expenditures are the things that you can throw money at and then it's done. So hospitals, the actual building of the new RAH hospital was a capital expenditure. The ongoing spending of it to pay the nurses, the doctors and the other staff, lighting, that's all current expenditures. Other examples, roads, rail, school buildings and ports. Any sort of physical capital and infrastructure is a capital expenditure, and I like to think of this as more of an investment spending from the government. They're spending money now to invest for the future. Then there are transfer payments. Transfer payments are just cash payments to people, like our unemployment benefits and disability pensions. As we know, these do not count towards GDP, as no good or service is being produced. That is in comparison to current and capital expenditures, where they are buying goods and services. Lastly, we need to understand the terminology of budgets. When revenue equals expenditures, it's a balanced budget. A budget surplus is when revenues are greater than expenditure. A country like Norway consistently has large budget surpluses. Then when expenditures are greater than revenues, it's a budget deficit. Australia has had budget deficits since 2009. Then these were first triggered by the global financial crisis. This has led to huge growth in government debt, as loans must be taken out to meet our expenditure commitments. Government debt is now over 40% of GDP of Australia. And of course, the only way to bring down this debt is to have budget surpluses. Okay, that's all we need to know right now for this part of the course, and we'll be using what you've learned here in class.